And the funding's from the federal government through the land care funding, and it's for Farm Smart. So we're running grazing workshops, 3 grazing workshops in 3 different areas of Tasmania. Then we're running a cover cropping with Colin Sice, and then we're going to run a planning for profit. So so that people can sort of see how to put it all together to make a business out of it. So the first couple are sort of does it work for you, and will it be the right thing for you? And then the last one, how do you put it together for a profit? Okay, so the agenda I had was that I'll just do a short presentation just to warm everyone up. But the idea is that sort of, to jump in at any stage and stop me, and we can discuss things and do whatever you want, because it's about sort of, will this workshop be what you're after? And we'll give you that information and knowledge that you want, and then we'll just do a quick Q&A at the end. So I'll keep it around that hour if that works for people, and we can see how we go. Excuse me. People that know me would understand that sort of I'm really not interested in practices that slow the car down as we go over the cliff. I'm really only interested in practices that turn the car around and drive away from the cliff. I feel like we sort of need to really take some very urgent action on what we're doing with agriculture and what we're doing with land health and biodiversity. We've just come back from working in Brazil. So we've just come back from working in Brazil. Had 5 weeks sort of in the southeast and then in central Brazil working with ranchers, basically. Everything I do is about grass and grazing animals. So perennial grass specifically, and sort of don't do a lot of other discussion on other things. So it's very focused. It was really interesting that, like they had sort of 18 staff on most ranches, and just keep letting in. But it was in the middle of winter. So this is a summer growing grass down in the bottom right-hand corner, and it was sort of knee-high summer growing grass. So a lot of that sort of Bos Indicus type cattle, but their own breed up from that. And in the bottom left, that's me talking at at one of the universities. So we got to talk to some of the kids, which I thought was fantastic. Excuse me. So what was really interesting was they didn't understand the importance of perennial grass, and they didn't understand that grazing cows and sheep can be used in a positive way. All the information that they get is that it's just a degrading practice, not a regenerating practice. So that took a fair bit of work. And the really big problem that I saw was that they've put so much of Brazil, which needs to be about 50% grassland and 50% rainforest. They put most of that sort of grassland area to soy and corn, and so massive use of nitrogen fertilizer and massive use of nitrogen fertilizer and sort of degrading practices. Lots of spraying it out. So just quickly skimming along, I'll be talking about, if I can get this to work, I'll be talking about sort of profit and net farm income, and how do we actually keep more of the gross. So on this graph here, the green line's the gross value of the farm production in Australia, and the blue line's the net value. So even though the gross is going up quite well, the net's not keeping pace. More and more of the gross income of each farm is going to input costs and on costs. So how do we cope with that? How do we make sure that we keep more of that rather than less of that? The really interesting thing on that graph as well is that debt sort of gone through and broken through gross value of farm profit in the early 2000s. So we'll be talking about risk and the need for the need to sort of focus on minimising losses rather than maximising production. It's very clear that if you focus on maximising production, you keep less money in the business. So there's a lot of research on that. So we'll be focusing on minimising losses, so low risk, low cost, profitable enterprises. So a real shift to profit and how to keep profit and money in the business over time. It's sort of a different sounding to a lot of the other advice out there, but we've got sort of really clear evidence that that's the way to head, and I'll put some of that up a little bit later. So the other thing we'll be talking about is type something if I'm going too fast, is management as decision making. There's a real focus on what we do in working about with people in complexity, so that third level there. So, simple decisions are pretty straightforward. Everyone knows what's going to happen. It's pretty self-evident. Another one to think of is sort of driving on the left-hand side of the road. Everyone knows that's the rule. So how to get that a little bit more complicated, you'd need an expert here to come in and help you. And in the complex area, which is sort of like running a farm, you actually have to do the work yourself, because no one understands the way your land reacts. So the processes we use are different, and we'll be talking about sort of how do decisions change your trajectory. I have a real thing about sort of we'll set a direction, and then it's how fast you want to change. So, but we'll have the information, and then you can decide. Nice, interesting spelling of health. You'll be able to decide sort of what levels of profit, soil health, and sort of time for time to relax and spend with the family and friends do you actually need. So that's really individual, but I believe that all our decisions need to be in a direction that's sort of heading in that direction. So increasing our profit, increasing our soil health, and improving our quality of life. So that's sort of just a graph I got from a woman that I work with in America, but like what we've seen is this is what happens if people start focusing on sort of that triple bottom line. So this is from a farm in the southwest slopes of New South Wales. He's sort of a well-known farmer in that area. Round about that year 6, year 7, he actually won New South Wales Farmer of the Year, but no one had asked him was he actually making money. So he realised that it wasn't the way to go, and he shifted and changed he shifted his practices to lower cost, lower risk, and sort of kept more money in the business and started making profit. So this was during the millennial drought. So there was that was going down. And I've seen the updated graph, but I couldn't find it tonight to put in that he actually then turned it around. And we keep looking at how do you take corrective action to turn those trends around. Some of the other things that we'll be talking about is that the different environments. This is sort of a really big issue in Brazil because it was in some areas incredibly non-brittle, whereas in other areas it was very brittle. So, and it's to do with seasonal humidity, this idea. So in non-brittle environments, this is sort of Angkor Wat in Cambodia. In these non-brittle environments, you find the ruins of the civilizations under jungle. They're still finding civilizations there. So, buildings there under the jungle, and they're picking them up from space and from flying aerial photos because they can see these straight lines in under the jungle vegetation. So if you can get back far enough, you can see that it was much bigger than what they thought. So that's an environment that's continually humid. We recognise that this was sort of different areas of Brazil that we were working in were very non-brittle. the rainforest, what's in the news at the moment. But there's another type of environment where we collapse the civilizations. You'll find the ruins in the desert or under sand. So this is sort of a significant difference. And these ones are the seasonally humid environments. So you'll have a wet period and you'll have green growth, and then you'll have a dry period and the carbon stops cycling. And it was in those environments that we need to actively manage to regenerate the land. If you lock those areas up, they get worse. If you lock these areas up, they get better. So there's sort of two extremes, and it's really clear that we need to know where they are. About 2/3 of the land's surface is sort of brittle. It doesn't have here the Midlands or sort of a lot of that central areas through Tasmania that are quite brittle. They need a lot of help to cycle carbon. So this area here around was where we were working in Brazil, up Brownting through here, which is sort of a brittle area. It was a grassland. But even the locals sort of were a bit mystified with this because they'd been told that the whole area was rainforest when it clearly wasn't. And they had megafauna that, grassland megafauna that they can still find the fossils for. So in those environments, it's really, sorry, I've got someone waiting. In those environments, that was where you had the large herbivores. Let me see if I can get that up. Yeah, so that was where the large herbivores, because they cycled the carbon, because they carried the moisture and the bugs around with them. So it's all about how do you get that moisture, and that moisture and the bugs was in the rumens of those the wildebeest and the grazing animals. So the whole theory, the idea of this is that you can regenerate the land. G'day, Matthew. You can regenerate the land if you actually know the difference between these brittle and non-brittle. And in the brittle environments, we need in some way to cycle and complete the carbon cycle. And that was typically done before we started using fire in a completely damaging way worldwide. It was in that sort of, sorry, just a bit of this, a bit of that. And in those environments, you typically had the large herbivores, and you also had predators. So, this is sort of the marsupial lion, and the thylacine, and I had the wolves and things like that from when we were in Brazil. So, and all we'll be doing is talking about. All we'll be doing is talking about. Sorry, I just mute you, Josh. We'll just be talking about sort of how we're going to mimic that behaviour, just to see, well, does it work on your land? What's the brittleness on your land? How does your land respond? What's the soil seed bank? Does this make sense on your property? So we'll be doing sort of practice areas that allow you to sort of mimic this behaviour. Very quick, easy to do, 2 or 3 hours, a very small area of the property. And you can just sort of work out, well, does it work or does it not? And once we know whether it works or not, then you can start sort of saying, well, how do I make that into a grazing business over the whole farm? So this will be about regenerating grasslands. We find we can regenerate native grasslands. I manage Stiper native grasses, and sort of, which is a farmer-led not-for-profit charity that started in Central West New South Wales, and it just focuses on sort of how do we use native grasses in productive agriculture. So we can be talking about a lot of that as well, how to make that work. We'll be talking about the time, and this is sort of really poorly understood. People have heard sort of grazing management and different practices, cell grazing and things like that. We'll be finding out sort of by doing the practice areas exactly what it needs on your land, what's the recovery time, and then how long can they be in a paddock before you're getting signs of overgrazing? So invariably, most of the training is the recovery times are too short. And it's usually because people are worried about spending too long in the paddock, when no one ever fails from sorry, Matthew, no one ever fails from staying too long in a paddock. They always fail from coming back too quick. And that's what we'll be going through, just making sure people sort of, can everyone see the chat box? I'll just make sure. I'll just plug in that just so hopefully it pops up for you. Very good. Yeah, so what does that look like on your land? These are sort of pretty extreme photos with sort of quite a few animals and stuff, but like this can be done at any scale. And we'll be talking about how we promote the germination and establishment of the viable perennial grass seed bank. Just someone keeps dropping off, sorry. Might just be an internet problem. Yeah, so just what does that look like? We'll be talking about sort of how deep do you need to graze into the grass. So that's poorly understood as well, and is causing quite a lot of confusion. People don't know whether to graze it lightly or heavily, and we'll be giving photo standards, very clear information on what to try and what do we know that works. And so we'll come back to that. So, sorry, I'll just make sure. So even though the animals have only been in an area for a very short period of time, they don't actually graze by height. They find a plant that they like and graze it to the ground. So, and high utilisation ensures that you keep your better perennial grasses. So that's sort of some of those things that we'll be doing and challenging. But the key to what we'll be doing is how do you check whether that works or not? So not this is the way to do it. The work that we do will be, does that work on my farm? And then can I turn that into a business? So the whole approach and the whole focus is really how do you do the work to know what works for you, rather than pretending that we're working in the complicated area and that you can use expert advice. So one of the other things we'll be doing is looking at sort of how do you read the land. There's a lot of discussion about reading the land, but we'll be actually showing what is the science behind that. So I really like landscape function, and people that have heard me speak before will know that sort of I even old hard to train people can be taught that. So like Colin Seiss there and myself. So it's really about sort of how do we start reading the land? What do we find? And this is probably the most relevant science for grasslands that you can find. It's about sort of how does it work and how does it provide stability, water infiltration, and nutrient cycling. So what do you have to look at? So if you want to look at sort of how do you increase stability, you've got to look at soil cover and measure that, and then litter cover. Now, I don't meet any farmers that don't know that sort of stability or lack of erosion is caused by soil cover and litter cover. I just don't meet them, but a lot of practices are still ending up with bare ground between the plants. So degrading cropping and degrading grazing ends up with bare ground between the plants. The other thing is, if you want the water to infiltrate, it's how much of each hectare, this number 2 here, this basal cover of perennial grass, how much of each hectare is covered by the base of a perennial grass plant has a really big impact. Again, litter cover, and then how rough is the surface. The rougher the surface, the more likely it is to act as tiny little dams and capture water and nutrients and stuff as it goes across. The let me go. And then for the nutrient cycling, it's sort of, again, the basal cover of the perennial grass. So how much of each hectare? So we want really big bases of grasses so that we can cycle nutrients. And then we want decomposition of the litter. So it's about sheet composting. For gardeners, this is really simple stuff. But if you want the nutrients to cycle in the soil, you've got to have sheet composting between the plants. And the difference that we do in grasslands is that we grow the compost in situ, and then we get it to decompose by pushing it onto the soil surface with the feed of the animals. So the hard hooves of the goats, the sheep and the cattle, the horses, all those other animals, they're a real problem if the ground's bare, and they can do a lot of damage. But if the ground's covered, they're actually very positive. So the same animal that is destroying biodiversity, the cow, which I believe is the #1 cause of biodiversity loss in Australia because it's being used inappropriately. If you change how you're applying the animals to the land, it can also be one of the most regenerative animals that we use. And again, surface roughness is really important. So so that's the relationships, and we'll do that, and we'll actually go out in the paddocks and make sure that when you're looking at the land, that you can actually read what's going on. Is it cycling nutrients? Is it not? So, is it all going well? So they're the relationships. The science is sort of building. One of my sort of burning things is that everyone says there's no science, and that's not true. There's heaps of science now, but the problem is that there's sort of everyone that then says, oh, well, yes, there is, but it's not done locally. So when I had a stint at the DPI in Victoria, and that was really sort of frustrating for me that they kept saying that there wasn't. So this is a really good paper, and we'll be talking about this. This is by Sue Ogilvie and Mark Gardner and the others, Jackie Sherman, and I can't say Thylak's name, and Elizabeth Hegney and Kimberly Brown. They did this wonderful work and found that people that are doing long-term sort of regenerative grazing, have equal, if not better, profitability than the top 20%. They've got biodiversity increasing, and they have incredibly high wellbeing scores. So well above the average. The only wellbeing score that they didn't go so well on was that they tend to be ostracized by their community because they were managing differently. So, I'll make sure that you get all that, all the warts and all the detail that you're going to need to know before you start, that you'll have to put practice areas in, that you'll have to be doing, probably changing the animals. You might have to change your time of calving and lambing. There's a lot of benefits of this type of management, but there's also a lot of barriers. So a lot of the current animals just aren't suited. There's more in Tasmania than on the mainland, where they've mainly been selected for feedlot performance, and then the cows have got too much of a maintenance energy requirement, and the sheep have got too much of a maintenance energy and won't perform. So when I was with the DPI, I had to actually clip out of their own brochures. So this was work done by Lisa Warren, which was fantastic work, and this was done by Rito Zollinger and Zongnan Ni at Hamilton DPI, where I was. And Rito came to a Stiper conference up in Mudgee that I was talking at, and then he came back and then he reproduced that. So that work was done in the Ararat Hills. So everyone's saying, oh, it's only up north and things like that. So the same things applied. So we'll be looking at all the science and what does it say. We'll be talking about how plants grow. Really clearly, we'll need to know sort of about leaf emergence and just exactly how does a grass grow. If you don't know that, it's really hard to get really sensible answers. So when is it ready to be grazed? And sort of we'll be talking about this definition that's based on sort of work that we've done sort of with Sydney University. So Stiper had a project on action on the ground project on increasing soil carbon, and they did all the research and monitoring of what we were doing. And we found that this was the definition of when a grass is recovered. So when it looks like an ungrazed plant and contains fresh yellow litter, and I've tried to show that down here and also between the plants here, so that this is the fresh yellow litter. And that depends on leaf emergence rate, which is driven by temperature and soil moisture. There is an effect of previous management, but so you need to know that you've got to go out into the paddock and monitor. So I'm taking a little bit longer, just quickly through some photos. This is the sort of difference. So this was work that I did on a property I owned in southwest Victoria. So we started with bare ground, and then just through management alone. So no herbicide, no seed, no fertilizer, just grazing, put it back to grass. Now that sort of sounds like a long call for people, but that's the thing that we'll be showing you, and you'll know how to do it. You may choose not to do it that way, but you will know how to do it just using grazing animals. And I think that's the key, because then you get to sort of decide, well, am I going to do this or am I going to do that? So just using grazing. So I know you don't have capeweed in Tassie, but we had some capeweed in southwest Victoria. That was sort of, I needed the translator be saying he's trying to make a joke. This is capeweed, sort of, so the place was sort of had been cropped and not resown and things. So it was a timber core property that had been leased out, and then just using grazing, we got the grass to regrow. So it's that sort of change that I want you to be able to do and know how to do. So any weed control, any pasture re-establishment, you've always got a base reference of what's the lowest cost, lowest risk practice that I can use to start with. So it tends to be the most profitable because it is the lowest cost and the lowest risk, but it may be slower than what you want. So you'd then do another trial. Is it worthwhile, using seed or using fertilizer? But you've got a base reference. You've got something that I can do this with the animals. So this is just another paddock. So it sort of looked like this on the left when we took over. This is in March last year. So just back to a perennial paddock. We'll be talking about this a lot, sort of this safe to fail practice areas. How do you do a small trial or set up a small practice area so that you can see, how do I actually learn these skills? How do I get it to, yeah, we do, Matthew, sorry. Yeah, how do we actually get this information? How do we find out? How does our land respond? Do you know, there's a lot of problems with people providing advice that doesn't travel. With this workshop, you'll be able to say, I actually know what I have to do before I do it, because we've done these practice areas. So they're just small areas. So put the sheep in, it was all quite long grass here, it was over the fence. And then that's a photo from another time. And then trample it down and leave the ground covered, and then repeat, rinse and repeat. So you need to monitor so that you've got photos of when you put them in, what did it look like, what happened to the weed burden, what happened to the perennial grass regeneration. So just quickly, I'll just do, I'll just put this up. This is satellite data for ground cover. This is developed by CSIRO, and it's now you can buy it as a subscription service for your property. And this is sort of since 1991 on a farm that I work with up near Canberra, near Braidwood, a place called Naringla, just past Araluen. So this is the district average through the middle of the ground cover, the difference between the yellow and the green. Well, not a very steady hand. So prior to doing some training in regenerative grazing, they were consistently lower than the district average for ground cover. So they were always struggling, trying to keep money, selling stock, feeding stock, putting them out on adjustment, going droving with them. So it was always a bit of a stress. So then, at this red line, they went and did some regenerative grazing practice, some holistic management, and then things started to move upwards. But again, it was very random and it was up and down. So they'd have a lot of feed or they'd have no feed. They'd have a good run of years and then they'd come back to the average. So there was a trend up. The father of the guy that I'm working with now, he then left. We called this the yo-yo years, when it was sort of like buy stock, sell stock, get grass, get no grass. Always trying to pay the bills, trying to pay the debt. And then the father left, and just Peter and I have been working together ever since, using the safe to fail practice areas and what we know about sort of the definition of when a perennial grass is recovered, adjusting the stocking rate and modifying sort of when we're carving and redesigning sort of the selecting animals that perform in that sort of management. And since then, it's been consistently higher ground cover, as well as sort of more profits. So profits about that, not having these losses. So this is typically is what I see a lot with people that are practicing grazing management, is that they buy animals when they've got grass, and they seem to be able to buy them, buy high, sell low is what I say. So they buy them when they're dear, and then they sell them when they run out of grass, when they're low. So Peter's busted all that now, and he can just go straight through. So and sort of how are we going? I'll keep going. Is there any more questions or comments? I'll stop and unmute everyone in a minute. So this sort of, just to summarise, we used the same thing, this satellite ground cover. This was the property I owned in southwest Victoria. So when we took over, it was sort of bare ground in Cape Weed. Within 15 months, we could get clear runoff. We'd stopped sort of increase the stability to the point that we had clear runoff off the property, and sort of we were also capturing more soil from all the neighbours in the river, in the creek, this is the Camp Creek, and it was actually filling up and sort of forming chains of ponds. I'd spent a fair bit of time with Peter Andrews, and so we did this with just vegetation and stopping erosion. We created the chain of ponds, and I've got a lot of examples on that, so we can talk about that as well. How do you do this low cost, low risk waterway regeneration? And then this was sort of during we had a pretty severe drought in 06, 07, and we grew a fair bit of grass. Excuse me. We grew a fair bit of grass, and then sort of we grazed all that down over the drought. So, and when the drought broke, we'd carried 10 DSE a hectare through that period, and we had clear runoff. So this had 100 mil on the 20th of January 2017, and then by the end of March, 27th of March, we had this sort of feed. I was at the DPI, and I took my photos in because I was pretty happy with myself, thought I was pretty clever. And we're having sort of morning tea. And so all the pasture scientists said, oh, well, what's the palatability of that feed, Graham? Because, it's high in fibre, low in protein, low in energy. But I knew they'd have something like that. So I'd already prepared for them. So I had these photos ready to go next. And when they said, what's the palatability? I said a lot higher than dirt. So this was the high input phosphate trial. That's the recommended trial that had been destocked for months, but they hadn't published that and didn't tell anyone. And they said, oh, it's just the same as what farmers would do, putting the animals out into a stock containment area. and this was a farmer practicing sort of at the time best practice. So it was an absolute disaster. So they were asking me what's the palatability of the grass, and I couldn't understand what they were talking about. To me, that was a much better outcome than that one. So that was all I had. So I was just going to unmute everyone. If you wanted any questions, or how do we do this? I'm just a bit worried that it might be a bit noisy. So if there's a lot of background noise at your place, if you could mute yourself or take that off, but I'll just unmute everyone and see if there's any questions or comments or any further information you'd like about the workshops. Sorry, any questions, comments? How was that? Yeah, there's a question here. It might be best if they do come in. I'm getting a fair bit of feedback. If you could type them in, and I'll try and do that way. Oops, it won't go. Okay. Maria, you can, in theory, use native animals. They're very hard to manage, though. Most of our native animals sort of hard to sort of use in a way that's positive. I believe that our kangaroos would have ran in quite big mobs, and there would have been behaviours from the water flooding out and different types of things happening, so that they would have actually sort of regenerated the land. There's a lot of discussion about what was the megafauna and their role, and Tim Flannery actually has in the Future Eaters that there was kangaroos with hooves. So there's a lot of confusion and stuff. So I don't know how to do it. So but if someone could show me how to do it, I'd be really happy. I'm not anti the idea. I love the idea. I just don't know how to do it. And I'm saying that everything that we do must be about regenerating the land while we produce food. So how do we regenerate? So how do we take agriculture, tip it on its head so that it's actually restoring biodiversity while we produce food? At the moment, we're trying to sort of slow down the rate of decay, and it's just not working. So it's a really it's a screaming example with what's happening in the Amazon at the moment. So no, Michael, the workshops are going to be done. They're on the RANT website, which is www.rant.net.au, and on there, I'll have to get my calendar up. Brain's full. But it's a week in September, and there's 3 workshops. There's the Tuesday, the Wednesday, and the Thursday. But I can send that out to everyone because I'll have those. I'll have those dates. Oh, here they come now. Yeah, so I'll put them up in a sec. Yeah, so they'll be live, the workshops, and there also will be some opportunities for a few when we're going around setting up different practice areas on different farms. So yeah, so that people can join in sort of as long as they're self-contained and don't need looking after. They can come in and join in as we're setting up. So I've got the dates wrong. So Monday, the 9th of September, will be in the Northwest, Tuesday, the 10th at Longford, and Wednesday, the 11th at Ross. So, but if you go onto the website, there's a link to the Eventbrite page. So there, so yeah. They're going to be repeats, Debbie, basically. So they'll be sort of the same workshop, but in the 3 different areas. So, there'll be slight variations, but really basically just to sort of repeats so that people can get set up and get going and hopefully get enough from this workshop to start sort of progressing and seeing if regenerative grazing is going to be for them. And it'll be similar with the regenerative cropping or the cover cropping. So, Kelly, there's no minimum farm size to be able to farm regeneratively. There's as long as sort of my expertise is in animals and perennial grass. And there's a good reason for that, because that's also the problem that we're having. We haven't got enough perennial grass through all the grasslands. We've taken that all out. We've made a lot of the areas annual. And we've also put in other flatweeds and, other plants. I call them flatweeds. So a grassland to be healthy basically needs to be predominantly grassland. And if you want to improve the health of a grassland area, then you've got to improve the perennial grasses. And the research is clear that annual litter is not as good as perennial grass litter. And so the perennial grasses, if you want to rapidly restore soil health, the best way is through the perennial grass. So do you know, once people, I'm talking to them and trying to explain that the largest terrestrial store of carbon is actually in the soil. So there's more carbon in the soil than the vegetation and the atmosphere combined. So we need to know that that's where the majority of the carbon needs to be. And the reason I focus on perennial grasses is because they're not trying to create woody components. They actually put more carbon straight into the soil. So the fibrous roots of the perennial grasses allow that to happen the quickest. And it causes a lot of people a lot of stress and stuff. But I go, well, that's what the science is. So that's what I focus on. So it really will be about perennial grass and grazing. So I don't want people to turn up and go, oh, I thought it was going to be about sort of something else. It'll be introduced perennial grasses, and we can also talk about Australian natives as well. The workshops weren't going to be recorded, Michael. It's $50 for the first farm and then $25 for the other farm, and that's just because of the funding that we've got from the Farm Smart grant. So it's quite cheap sort of for the day. Sorry, I dropped any chance of the workshops could be repeated in Victoria, particularly Gippsland. Yeah, we've got similar work going on in over in the Macedon Ranges, Kelly, but at the moment we've been running a series of workshops up at I can't think of it. Delatite River. No, that's not quite right. Sort of up on the border with New South Wales, and we're sort of working with Emma Orgel on sort of do we do some more and that sort of stuff. So Emma would be the one sort of to chase, sort of to get us funded to do more workshops. So Alison, yeah, we are, Alison. I don't know where you are, but yeah, definitely. Everyone's welcome. It's sort of the $50 is. So that'd really apply. So we're looking at sort of trying to get some funding to run sort of small farms down in the Huon. But sort of these ones will be mainly on the bigger farms, sort of up at Ross, Longford and the Northwest. So, but yeah, definitely needs, and it's the same principles. It's the same thing. So, yeah, Ray, that's a really good question. Are there areas of Australia where perennial grasses may not grow well? Yeah, there is, but yeah, like I'd sort of refer back to this and this brittleness map, if I can hope people doesn't make them go. So not everywhere. So some of this East Coast doesn't need to be in grassland to be healthy, and parts of Tassie definitely don't need to be in health. I was working with a dairy farm at Apollo Bay down on the Great Ocean Road, and it's the only soil that I've ever measured that was more fungal than bacterial while it was under conventional agriculture, so nitrogen fertilizer and herbicides and insecticides. So just a conventional dairy farm. And it was fungal. It wanted to be trees. It would be healthier as trees. It wasn't brittle. It rained all summer. You know, it wasn't a seasonally humid environment. So those environments that can maintain 100% ground cover under the trees, then they're definitely the ones that need to be just in complete forest. The other areas that can't maintain ground cover and struggle to cycle carbon, and they're more prone to burning in the summer or in the dry season for up north. They're the areas that need to be either a grassy woodland or a grassland. So they're quite different, and I see that sort of this focus on trees everywhere is going to cause us a great deal of problems, because we'll need those other areas to be grasslands. So we're decimating the grasslands with cropping, and we need to work out how we're going to do it. The only way I know at the moment, and sort of, I've got confirmation bias like everyone else, is the only way I know how to do it is with grazing animals at the moment. So, and how do we get there? So, yeah, so definitely areas that should be more forested, and definitely areas that need to be perennial grasses. People, I've worked with people like, up at Willaluka, sort of in South Australia, up towards Keith and those areas, and they'll say, oh, it's too dry for perennial grasses there. And then as we're driving through the paddock, there'll be 2 tracks of perennial grass through there. So yeah, yeah. Oh, great, Alison, you're in the Huon. So I stopped talking. Sorry, got distracted. So yeah, we'll share the workshops, and we'll work out how so to make sure that with everyone. And if you could share when we send out sort of I've recorded this, and I'll put it up as a link so that people can skim back through it if you can't get to the workshops. If you could share any of the workshops with your networks, that'd be great. We're still working on sort of the dates for the cropping one, and the financials is going to be in the new year, next year. Any other questions? How's that all going? Has that explained clearly sort of what we're trying to do at these workshops? I hope I have. I didn't want people to turn up and go, oh, it's going to be about another subject. So I hope I've done that, and I hope I've sort of provided some of the information. So okay. Any other questions? Any other comments? Any other feedback? Thanks, Josh. Thanks, Debbie. Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks, Ray. Great. Thanks, Kelly. Well, we'll have to get over to Gippsland. So, thanks, everyone. So, feel free to contact me. I'll if you have any questions at any time, or you think, well, what did he say there, and what did that mean? I'm really happy to take any sort of emails and phone calls. So, thanks, Katie. Thanks, Amy. At that, I'll end the meeting. Thanks for your time. I hope that's been worthwhile. Bye.